Welcome to the third of the lectures on the Antichrist. And in this lecture, we will be looking at Nietzsche's discussion about the history of Christianity and how he ties that into what he sees as some of the problems of Christianity. We'll then look a little bit at how he discusses antiquity and Islam before concluding the lectures. Nietzsche then is looking at the history of Christianity and tying it into his ideas about its morality. And at this point, he is critical of anti Semitism because he argues that it's based on an incorrect understanding of the history of the church. And he says that from a Christian point of view, the Christian morality is a result and comes out of the Jewish tradition. And he says here, I only touch on the problem of the origin of Christianity here. The first proposition towards its solution is Christianity can be understood only by referring to the soil out of which it grew. It is not a counter movement against the Jewish instinct, it is actually its logical consequence. Nietzsche says, the Jewish people define themselves counter to all those conditions under which a nation was previously able to live, was permitted to live. They made of themselves an antithesis to natural conditions. For the kind of man who desires to attain power through Judaism and Christianity, the priestly kind, decadence is only a means. This kind of man has a life interest in making man sick and in inventing the concepts good and evil, true and false, in a morally dangerous and world-culminating sense. So we're coming back here to Nietzsche's concept of the priestly type. And what he's saying here is that the priestly type, as we know, has an interest in keeping humanity sick and in having these concepts of good and evil to assert their own power. And he's claiming that the kind of person who has these tendencies can exist within Christianity and Judaism and to thrive within them. As Nietzsche moves through the history of Christianity, one of the things that he does is to separate out Christ from Christianity. And what he argues is that Christ and Christianity should be separated, as Christ's example was very different from the Christianity it resulted in. He says the word Christianity is already a misunderstanding. In reality, there has only been one Christian, and he died on the cross. And what he argues is that Christ was a free spirit, and he argues that he challenged the teachings of the priestly class. He says that one could call Jesus a free spirit. He cares nothing for what is fixed. And he sees Jesus as being a contrast to the priestly type in terms of his psychological type. He says that he is a different individual, that he doesn't fit in with the conception of the priestly type and their resentment. Nietzsche argues then that the followers of Jesus reinterpreted him in order to base Christianity on the priestly type. What his point is here is that he argues that Jesus' followers were angry that Christ was allowed to die on the cross, and they were filled with resentment at his killers. Now, Nietzsche argues that what this led to was a turn towards the priestly type, this feeling of resentment, and the followers of Jesus therefore building their Christian morality upon this rather than the actual life of Jesus. Now, Nietzsche actually also argues that Christians reject this life in favour of the next. We've seen this argument from Nietzsche before, that Christians are too focused on what is the afterlife and the rules of the afterlife rather than living within this life. And he argues that our separation between Christ and Christianity is part of that Christ was this free spirit that lived an example within this life. And he argues that the priestly type, in contrast, in line with Christian morality, is living for the next life. Nietzsche considers out of all of Jesus' disciples that Paul was the real problem here. And he argues that Paul was the worst of the disciples, the one most interested in power and most leading into that priestly type. And he says, on the heels of the glad tidings came the worst of all, those of Paul. What does this dissensionalist not sacrifice to his hatred? The life, the example, the teaching, the death, the meaning and the right of the entire gospel. Nothing was left once this hate-obsessed false coiner had grasped what alone he could make use of. His requirement was power. With Paul, the priest again sought power. He could employ only those concepts, teachings, symbols with which one tyrannizes over the masses, forms herds. So again, we're led back to this idea of the priestly type and herds. And Nietzsche really sees Paul as embodying this priestly type and being symbolic of the problem that he sees as being Christianity. Nietzsche at this point starts to tie in the history of Christianity to the influences of antiquity and Islam, and he argues that we have not learned as much as we could have from these cultures. So he argues that the lessons learnt from antiquity have been ruined by cunning, secret, invisible, anemic vampires, not conquered, only sucked dry. He says every prerequisite for an erudite culture was on the best possible road, overnight merely a memory. Now, this is a reference to the Renaissance, which we shall discuss a bit more in a minute. But he also says of Islam, he says the wonderful Moorish cultural world of Spain was trampled down because it was noble, because it owed its origins to manly instincts, because it said yes to life. Now, we know, of course, that Nietzsche had a good understanding of the ancient Greeks, but he was also interested in the influences of Islam, and he argues that these were cultures which looked to say yes to life more. And of course, we know that he feels that Christianity does not do this. And he feels that Christianity and the priestly type have led us to reject what we could have learned from these other cultures. Nietzsche talks about the Renaissance as a time when we possibly could have had a revaluation of Christian values. But he argues that we didn't take that opportunity. He says Christianity would have been abolished. What happened? A German monk, Luther, went to Rome. This monk, all the vindictive instincts of a failed priest in him, fulminated against Rome, against the Renaissance. What Luther saw was the corruption of the papacy, while precisely the opposite was palpably obvious. The old corruption, the peccatum originale. Christianity no longer sat on the papal throne. Life sat there instead. The triumph of life, the great yes to all lofty, beautiful, daring things. And Luther restored the church. He attacked it. So he sees Luther as attacking the Renaissance, as attacking the opportunity to have a revaluation of Christian values. And he talks about how the Germans are responsible for this, that he sees German culture as being hugely problematic in not having a revaluation of Christian values. In terms of Christianity and the future of philosophy, Nietzsche believes that philosophy has been polluted by Christianity. He argues that the underlying Christian values mean that philosophy is always focused on the spirit rather than the natural world, and he sees this as a huge error in philosophy. He says that the Christian church has left nothing untouched by its depravity. It has created states of distress in order to eternalize itself. So he argues then that if we are to move philosophy forward, we need to reject Christianity and Christian morality. One of the underlying themes of the Antichrist is the will to power. And of course, this is something that comes up when Nietzsche is talking about Christian morality, and when he is talking about how it focuses on the weaker instincts rather than what he sees as the stronger type. So he says, we've got several quotes here that we'll look at. He says, I call an animal depraved when it loses its instincts, when it chooses, when it prefers what is harmful to it. So he wants us to focus on what is good for ourselves evolutionary, and he sees this as being tied into the will to power, and that when we are not leaning into that will to power, what we are doing is losing our instincts. We are preferring what is harmful to it. He says again, I consider life itself instinct for growth, for continuance, for accumulation of forces, for power. Where the will to power is lacking, there is decline. My assertion is that this will is lacking in all the supreme values of mankind, that values decline, nihilistic values that hold sway under the holiest of names. So here he's tying in to this lack of will to Christian morality, the Christian values. And Ansel Pearson says in his work, in the Antichrist, he defines the good in terms of everything that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, and the bad in everything that proceeds from weakness. So what we have here is Nietzsche is saying that the good is anything that really brings us to that will to power, to the strong. And the bad is the things that are linked to Christian morality, to weakness, to pity. The Antichrist, then, is really a focus on Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity. And what he's arguing here is that Christianity is the plague which is underlying modern thought and modern philosophy. It's the problem that modern man needs to overcome. He thinks that Christian thought has led us to reject what we could have learned from antiquity, from Islam, and from the Renaissance. And he thinks that Christianity rejects life, that it is built on hatred and resentment. And we can really end here on this quote from Nietzsche, which I think sums up his views in this book, where he says, I call Christianity the one great curse.